Some people in the world believed they had the power to decide, instantly, who belonged and who didn't. And today, Malik Turner was about to experience that judgment firsthand. The moment Malik stepped up to the bank's grand entrance, a figure blocked his path. The smirk on the man's face said it all. He didn't belong here. But what they didn't know, Malik wasn't the kind to take no for an answer. And by the time he was done, the same people who had shut the doors in his face would be begging G to open them. As we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and be sure to hit the subscribe button if you find a valuable lesson in this story. The sun blazed down on the sidewalk outside Hamilton First Bank, the grand institution towering above the city streets like a monument to power and wealth. Men in tailored suits entered freely, their conversations crisp and filled with confidence. Women in polished heels clicked their way through the glass doors, moving with the ease of people who had never been told no. And then there was Malik. Standing just outside the entrance, he adjusted the sleeves of his suit, his grip firm around the folder in his hands, the folder that held the plans for a community development project that could change lives. But before he could step forward, something unexpected happened. A group of sharply dressed men exited the bank, deep in conversation. They were members of the bank's board of directors, easily recognizable by the way they carried themselves, by the way others instinctively moved aside for them. Malik took a step to the side, careful not to block their path, but it didn't matter. One of the men, an older board member with graying hair, brushed past Malik's shoulder just hard enough to be noticed. Malik turned. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone even. The man paused, glancing back with narrowed eyes. "Something wrong? I'd appreciate an apology," Malik replied, "or at least some acknowledgement that I'm standing here." Another board member scoffed under his breath. "Sensitive, aren't we?" The tension in the air thickened. It was the kind of moment that shouldn't have escalated. Just a simple misunderstanding, an awkward bump on a crowded sidewalk. But then it flared. A third board member, younger and clearly eager to prove himself, let out a sharp laugh. "This is public property, isn't it? I don't see why you're making a scene over a little shoulder brush." Malik's jaw tightened. "A little respect goes a long way," he said, still keeping his voice measured. But respect was the one thing they weren't willing to offer. "People like you are always looking for a problem." One of the men muttered, shaking his head. "Why don't you move along?" The words weren't loud, but they were meant to be heard. And that's when Richard Hall, the bank manager, stepped outside. His gaze flicked between Malik and the board members, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" One of the board members smirked and waved a hand dismissively. "Not anymore." Richard turned his attention to Malik, and in that moment, something cold and calculating settled behind his eyes. Malik could see it. The way Richard sized him up, the way he instantly made a decision about who he was and why he was there. "Yes? Why are you here?" Richard said. "I'm here for a meeting," Malik responded, nodding toward the bank entrance. "I have a proposal for a community development project that needs funding." Richard's lips curved into a smirk. "Is that so?" He didn't step aside, didn't ask Malik for his name or check if he had an appointment. He simply folded his arms and said, "I don't think this is the kind of place for that kind of business." Silence stretched between them. Malik's fingers tightened around his folder. "That kind of business is exactly what this bank claims to support," he countered. Richard chuckled, shaken. G his head. "Listen, why don't you take your ideas somewhere else? We cater to a very specific clientele. If you're looking for handout, there are plenty of." "I'm not here for a handout," Malik interrupted, his voice firm. That seemed to catch Richard off guard. His smirk faded for just a moment before he recovered. "Well, whatever you're here for, I'm afraid we don't have time for walk-ins, most especially to people with your status." The older board member chuckled under his breath as he tiered his car to leave. I didn't walk in, Malik said, because you're stopping me at the door. Richard's smile was tight, amused. You said it, not me. Malik exhaled slowly, his pulse steady but his patience thinning. I came here as a businessman, he said, locking eyes with Richard. I came here with a project that will uplift this city. A project that would be good for this bank. But instead of hearing me out, you've decided, before I even step inside, that I don't belong. Richard shrugged. If you want my honest opinion, I don't. Malik shot back. I want a meeting. Richard chuckled again, shaking his head like he had already won. Well, you're not getting one. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a real bank to run. And just like that, he turned his back. Malik stood still, watching as Richard strolled back through the doors without a second glance. Two board members followed, one of them offering Malik a final, mocking look before disappearing inside. And then, just like that, the doors closed. A rejection, wrapped in arrogance and delivered with a smirk. Have you ever been denied something? Not because you weren't qualified, not because you weren't prepared, but simply because someone decided you didn't belong? What did you do? Did you walk away? Or did you prove them wrong? Tell us in the comments. Malik Turner wasn't the type to walk away. Not anymore. He didn't need their permission. He would be back. In the end, EXT time he walked through those doors. No one would be able to stop him. If you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that subscribe button now. Because this story, it's just getting started. Malik stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, his grip tightening around the folder in his hands. He had built himself up from nothing, clawed his way into spaces that had not been made for him. And now, once again, someone had looked him in the eye and dismissed him. Malik refused to be defeated. He let the sting of rejection sharpen his resolve. If there was one thing he knew, it was this. A locked door was not the end of the road. It was simply an obstacle, and obstacles could be moved. He turned and walked towards his car with purpose, his mind already working, already shifting from disappointment to strategy on how to move forward. Malik reached his car, his mind sharp with focus, his body moving with the steady purpose of a man already planning his end. EXT move. As he reached for the door handle, a sleek black Mercedes rolled past him, slow and deliberate. The tinted window slid down, and behind the wheel sat Thomas Whitmore, the same board member who had brushed past him at the bank entrance, the same man who had looked through him like he wasn't even there. Now, Whitmore barely glanced in his direction, but as he lifted his hand, a steaming cup of coffee tumbled out of his window, spilling straight onto Malik's chest. Hot liquid splattered across his suit, the sharp sting biting into his skin, soaking into the fabric. Malik stood frozen, the sting of hot liquid burning against his skin. Whitmore smirked. And then, the words. You know, I don't know why your kind insists on forcing yourselves into places where you don't belong. The Mercedes never stopped, never slowed, just rolled forward, disappearing into traffic like nothing had happened. Like Malik wasn't even worth acknowledging. Malik stood still. He didn't flinch, didn't brush the coffee off his clothes, didn't move at all. He just inhaled, slow and deep. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. The world isn't fair, Malik, but that doesn't mean you let it win. His fingers curled into fists. You take what's yours. In that exact moment, something inside him hardened. This wasn't just about a rejection anymore. This wasn't about Whitmore or the bank manager. This was about all of them. Every single person who had ever looked at him and seen less. Every closed door. Every denied opportunity. Every smug, powerful man who had never once expected him to win. Back at his office, Malik sat at his desk, staring down at the papers spread out before him. Numbers, contracts, investment plans. Pieces of a puzzle he had spent a lot of time putting together. And for what? To stand outside of a bank he had the means to invest in, only to be told no before he even stepped foot inside? He shook his head. No way. That wasn't going to be his story. Then, a thought came to him. A wild, ridiculous thought. A thought that, the second it formed, felt like destiny. What if I could buy the bank? His heart pounded at the idea, adrenaline rushing through him like a storm. At first, it sounded impossible. But then, on second thought, not so much. He had built businesses from the ground up. He had secured investments, negotiated high-stakes deals, made money in spaces that had never been meant for him. He had the capital. He had the connections. And if the bank was anything like most corporations, it had weaknesses. What if he didn't ask for a seat at the table? What if he took the whole damn thing? His fingers reached for his phone before he even fully processed what he was doing. He scrolled through his contacts and found the name he was looking for. Mr. Jenkins, his investment banker. A man who had helped him move assets before. Someone who knew the ins and outs of financial acquisitions. Someone who wasn't afraid to play aggressively when the situation called for it. Mr. Jenkins, he said as soon as the line picked up, how hard would it be to take control of a bank? Mr. Jenkins chuckled on the other end. Depends. Do you have one in mind? Malik's eyes darkened with determination. I do now. Hamilton First Bank. Jenkins gave a low chuckle. Now that is interesting. If you had the chance to take control of the very institution that once shut you out, would you do it? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe in turning obstacles into opportunities, hit that subscribe button now. Malik and Mr. Jenkins sat in his office, their eyes scanning financial reports, market trends, and internal records. They're weaker than I thought, Jenkins muttered, flipping through another page. The cracks in Hamilton First's foundation were everywhere. Risky investment, TS, questionable partnerships, declining profits. And yet, the board had done what men like them always did. They covered it up. Instead of addressing their failures, they pushed losses onto their lower-level employees, tightened loan approvals for small businesses, and kept up appearances. But numbers didn't lie, and neither did inside information. Jamie had seen everything. A junior analyst, smart and observant, ignored by the very men who controlled the bank. To them, he was nothing more than another nameless employee, someone meant to follow orders, not ask questions. But Jamie had questions. Too many. Why were solid loan applicants denied funding while others, less qualified, less stable, were approved without hesitation? Why were certain files buried, certain names dismissed, certain opportunities quietly stolen? And when he came across documents hidden from public records, classified reports detailing financial mismanagement and systemic discrimination, he knew exactly what he had to do. One night, he reached out to Malik. They met after hours, in a quiet cafe far from the bank district. Jamie slid the folder across the table. Everything you need is in here, Jamie said. Malik didn't touch it right away. He studied Jamie instead. Why are you helping me? Jamie didn't hesitate. Because I've spent the last 5 years watching them make sure people like me. Like you never move up. I know what this bank is, and I know it needs to change. Malik exhaled slowly, nodding once before opening the folder. Page after page of hidden losses, internal scandals, and cold, statistical proof of discrimination. Jamie had just handed him the final piece of the puzzle. They think they're untouchable, Jamie said, but they're already falling apart. Someone just needs to finish the job. Jamie had no idea just how right he was. Malik closed the folder and left. Malik didn't move recklessly. He moved with precision. Through Jenkins and trusted third parties, he began acquiring shares. Slowly, quietly, never enough to raise suspicion. He built alliances with board members who were dissatisfied with leadership but too afraid to act alone. He gathered investors, powerful names who believed in his vision of financial equity. Bit by bit, control was shifting, and the board had no idea. But soon, they would begin to feel it. It started with whispers, reports of an unknown party buying up shares. Executives noticed the shifting in umbers, the influence slowly bleeding from their hands. Inside the boardroom, the tension grew thick. Who the hell is buying up this much stock? One director muttered, scanning reports. It's probably just outside investors, another said, forcing a laugh. We're fine. But they weren't fine. And soon, they'd realize it. Have you ever been in a situation where patience was your greatest weapon? Tell us about it in the comments. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if this resonates with you. Malik arrived at the bank, walking toward the door, each step calm and deliberate. The same security guard from before stiffened at the sight of him. As Malik approached, the guard stepped in front of him, raising a hand to block his path. Sir, you can't. It's okay. A voice interrupted from behind. The regional bank president emerged, his expression tense but respectful. Mr. Turner, he said, gesturing toward the corridor. This way, please. The guard hesitated, his confusion evident. Malik set in, offering him a brief glance before following the president into the bank. The air inside Hamilton First Bank was heavy with tension, the kind that hummed just below the surface, unseen, but impossible to ignore. This time, Malik Turner wasn't walking through the doors as a hopeful client. He was walking in as the owner. Just as he reached the corridor leading to the boardroom, Richard Hall stepped out of his office. His eyes locked on Malik, confusion giving way to irritation. What are you doing here? Richard demanded. Malik paused, turning slowly to face him. His expression was calm, controlled. No one let me in, Malik said, his tone even. I don't need permission in my own bank. Do I? For a split second, Richard froze, disbelief flickering across his face. And then, he laughed. You? Own this bank? He shook his head, crossing his arms. Nice try. Malik didn't flinch. As my first act as owner, he said, his voice steady and sharp, you're fired. Effective immediately. The words hit like a thunderclap, ringing in the air long after they were spoken. Richard's smirk faltered. You can't. Yes, I can, Malik interrupted. His eyes locked on Richard's. The regional president, standing nearby, didn't hesitate. He nodded to security, his voice calm but firm. Escort Mr. Hall out immediately. Two security guards stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. Richard's face turned pale. His eyes darted around, searching for support, but found none. This is a mistake, he said, his voice cracking. You'll regret this. Malik's eyes didn't waver. The only mistake was underestimating me. Richard's mouth opened to argue, but no words came. His shoulders sagged as reality settled in. But it was too late. The guards escorted him away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. And just like that, Richard Hall, the man who had once humiliated and underestimated Malik, was gone. Malik turned and walked towards the boardroom. Malik entered the boardroom. The executives sat waiting, their conversations silent. Said the moment they saw him. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others stared straight ahead, unsure of what was coming next. All except for one. Thomas Whitmore. His hand tightened around the armrest of his chair, his face pale as a memory surfaced. The coffee, the sidewalk, the smirk. For the first time, Whitmore fidgeted. Malik took his seat at the head of the table. Mr. Turner, Whitmore said, his voice carefully composed. We weren't expecting you. That's obvious, Malik said. Lean in. G back slightly. But you should have. The silence was suffocating. Whitmore cleared his throat. Perhaps you'd like to explain why you're here. Malik's eyes didn't waver. No need to explain. I'm simply here to inform you that I now own controlling shares of this bank. I'm your boss." Whitmore's breath hitched, his fingers twitching on the table. One of the younger board members who had confronted him outside the bank that day leaned forward, his face pale. "That's not possible." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Are you discriminating against me right now?" The young board member sank back into his seat, humiliated. Effective immediately, Malik continued, "There will be a complete restructuring of this board. To that effect, Mr. Whitmore, you're fired. From this moment, you no longer work here." Whitmore opened his mouth to protest but stopped, realizing the gravity of his mistake. He leaned back in his chair, silent. Malik scanned the room, his eyes locking on each of the board members who had stood outside the bank that day, the same ones who had dismissed him without a second thought. Those responsible for discriminatory practices will no longer have a place here. The room stayed silent, the tension thick enough to cut. "We will set new standards," Malik went on. "Standards of fairness, transparency, and equity. This bank will no longer be a fortress of exclusion. It will be a beacon of opportunity." No one spoke. No one dared to. They had already seen what happened to Richard, to Whitmore. They knew better than to challenge him now. What would you say to the people who once doubted you if you had the chance? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe in turning obstacles into opportunities, hit that subscribe button. The doors of Hamilton First Bank opened again, just as they always did. But this time, everything was different. Malik Turner stepped inside, not as a man asking for permission, not as a client hoping for a chance. He walked through those halls as the owner. Every step was deliberate, every glance a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He paused in front of the lobby entrance, the same place where Richard had once barred him from entering. Now, that space belonged to him. His eyes swept over the faces of the employees, some of whom avoided his gaze, unsure of what his presence meant. But others stood a little taller. Like Jamie, the young'un. A list approached Malik, his eyes filled with something far more powerful than relief: hope. "You have no idea how long we've been waiting for this," Jamie said quietly, his voice steady. Malik smiled. "We're just getting started. If you believe in breaking barriers and building a better future, hit that subscribe button. Because this journey, it's far from over. It continues with you." This story is one of resilience, determination, and the power of taking control when the world tries to shut you out. Malik Turner's journey reminds us that rejection isn't the end. It's often the beginning of something greater. By breaking barriers and creating opportunities, he not only changed his own life, but became a symbol of hope for his community. His story proves that with vision, strategy, and unwavering resolve, it's possible to turn obstacles into stepping stones and rewrite the rules. If you find a valuable lesson in this story, be sure to hit the subscribe button.